Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unraveling one of the absolute most fascinating economic mysteries of the modern world. I mean, just think about it for a second. How exactly does a landlocked, totally mountainous country, completely surrounded by historically aggressive empires, and possessing basically zero natural resources, become one of the wealthiest nations on planet Earth? It is a total paradox. Switzerland has no oil, no significant gold mines, no vast oceans for global trade. And yet, it's this multi-trillion-dollar economic titan.
Okay, let's dive into this. The answer to building a massive empire with absolutely no resources isn't about geographic luck, right? It's about sheer survival. The whole story of Swiss wealth is literally a masterclass in turning existential constraints into incredibly powerful global catalysts. Because, well, when you have absolutely nothing in the ground to dig up and sell, you have to engineer wealth through trust, extreme precision, and just relentless adaptation.
So to figure out how they pulled this off, we're going to look at four distinct pillars today. Number 1, the geopolitical shield. Number 2, the cultural pivot. Number 3, the strategic loophole. And finally, number 4, the human engine.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the geopolitical shield, focusing on neutrality and banking.
You know, when we hear the phrase Swiss neutrality, we usually think of it as this lofty moral stance. But historically speaking, it was just incredibly pragmatic. Just think about how this history builds. Back in 1515, the Swiss suffered this absolutely devastating military defeat at the Battle of Marignano. That effectively ended their expansionist ambitions and forced them out of international warfare for good. Fast forward to 1713, and the Great Council of Geneva passes a secrecy decree. Why? Well, mostly to protect the identities of European monarchs who were borrowing heavily from Swiss merchant banks to fund their own wars. Then in 1815, at the Congress of Vienna, major European powers officially guaranteed Swiss neutrality. They actually wanted a neutral buffer state right there in the middle of Europe. And finally, we hit 1934, which is when the Swiss codified banking secrecy into federal law. They made it a literal criminal offense to disclose client information. And that move was heavily driven by the desire to shield assets from foreign tax collectors during the Great Depression.
And that really brilliantly illustrates the conscious strategy behind the whole shebang. As the Swiss historian Sebastian Gueg put it, protected by the shield of our neutrality, our arm will be industry and finance. The Swiss bourgeoisie essentially looked at all the surrounding European powers tearing each other apart and realized, hey, our greatest asset here is stability. They intentionally used political neutrality as a giant magnet for frightened European capital. While revolutions and world wars raged all around them, the Swiss offered an impregnable Alpine vault for the world's wealth. Which leads us directly to a completely staggering number: $8 trillion. Today, Swiss banks manage approximately 8 trillion Swiss francs in foreign assets. To put that into perspective, that is over a quarter of all global cross-border private wealth. And even today, in our modern era of automatic tax data exchange and the end of absolute secrecy, the money still hasn't left. Because at the end of the day, the product they were selling wasn't just secrecy, it was unparalleled institutional trust and geopolitical stability.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, the cultural pivot and watchmaking.
So how exactly did a super strict religious mandate accidentally birth an empire of absolute luxury? Well, back in 1541, the Protestant reformer John Calvin took control of Geneva and instituted these really strict sumptuary laws. He outright banned the wearing of ostentatious jewelry. And as you can imagine, this was a total economic disaster for Geneva's highly skilled goldsmiths and jewelers. But they found a loophole. Calvin's doctrine actually permitted practical, functional instruments, so these newly unemployed jewelers just redirected their incredible metalworking skills into crafting portable pocket watches instead.
But the real explosion in scale happened when this craft moved north up into the Jura Mountains, creating what's known as the établissage system. The Swiss basically took their incredibly harsh, isolating Alpine winters and turned them into a massive advantage. Farmers, who were literally trapped indoors for months by the snow, used their fine motor skills to manufacture highly specialized, standardized watch components right in their own homes. These parts were then gathered up and assembled centrally. It was essentially this decentralized, hyper-efficient mass production engine that was quite literally centuries ahead of its time.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer scale of innovation that followed. The Swiss didn't just make watches, they basically perfected time itself. For instance, in 1770, they invented the self-winding rotor. In 1795, the tourbillon, which actually counteracted gravity's effect on accuracy. In 1816, the chronograph. These massive mechanical breakthroughs allowed the Swiss to utterly dominate the premium global market. Decades later, when the cheap quartz watch crisis of the 1970s nearly wiped them out, it was exactly this legacy of mechanical prestige that allowed them to pivot entirely into the luxury status symbols we know today under the Swiss-made label.
Let's transition over to Section 3, the strategic loophole and pharmaceuticals.
Believe it or not, this massive pharma industry didn't grow out of some noble national health strategy. Nope, it actually grew out of the dying textile dye trade and, well, intellectual property piracy. For roughly a century, right up until 1978, Switzerland operated in an environment of deliberately weak patent protection. They simply did not recognize product patents on chemical compounds. This meant Swiss chemical companies could freely reverse engineer foreign drugs from places like Germany or France and just launch them domestically without paying a single dime in licensing fees. It was this incredibly strategic, semi-patentless interlude that allowed them to accumulate massive amounts of capital. But when international pressure finally forced Switzerland to adopt strict IP laws in 1978, they knew they couldn't free ride anymore. So what did they do? They took all that accumulated wealth and just poured it into massive R&D, instantly transforming themselves from pirates into the global pharmaceutical pioneers they are today.
And the chemical lineage here is just so fascinating. The exact same chemical synthesis competencies that the Swiss developed to make synthetic aniline dyes for clothing textiles were ingeniously leveraged to invent some of the world's absolute most lucrative pharmaceuticals. I mean, they used this dye chemistry expertise to synthesize vitamin C in the 1930s, accidentally discover LSD in 1938, and eventually invent Valium in the early 1960s, which ended up becoming the world's very first true blockbuster drug. Pretty wild, right?
And that brings us to Section 4, the human engine, focusing on education.
You can have all the brilliant strategies in the world, but how exactly does a country without physical resources organize its human capital to actually sustain these high-tech industries? Well, get this. The vast majority of Swiss youth, around 70%, completely bypass the traditional university degree path straight out of high school. Instead, they opt for vocational education and training, or VET. In a lot of countries, vocational training is kind of unfairly stigmatized as a secondary option, right? But in Switzerland, it is the mainstream, highly respected gold standard. We're talking a pathway that even future CEOs and top bank directors go through.
And this dual-track system just works flawlessly. Students will spend maybe 1 or 2 days in a classroom and then 3 or 4 days actually working on site in a host company. So they get real hands-on learning, and they actually get paid while doing it. We're talking starting around $600 to $1,200 a month as a teenager. And most importantly, there are absolutely no educational dead ends here. A vocational student can always take an exam later on to enter a traditional university if they decide they want to. Plus, the curriculum is updated directly by trade associations. That means students are only being trained for jobs that actually exist and are in high demand right now. This whole system keeps Swiss youth unemployment incredibly low and provides a self-sustaining pipeline of ready-to-work talent for all those watchmakers, banks, and pharma labs we just talked about.
Which really leaves us with this final thought. When you trace the entire history of Swiss banking, horology, pharmaceuticals, and education, a really clear narrative emerges. Switzerland's incredible prosperity is absolutely not an accident of geography. In fact, their geography was probably their biggest hurdle. Their wealth is quite literally a masterpiece of human organization, extreme resilience, and the brilliant ability to turn severe constraints into incredible advantages. So I'll leave you with this question. Is true national wealth really found in the natural resources beneath our feet, or is it found in how brilliantly a society can adapt to having none at all? Something to think about for sure. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer today, and keep questioning the world around you.